Welcome to the IRS Solution Attorney Show. If you have problems with the IRS, don't focus on the negative, focus on the solutions. With the IRS Solution Attorney, Darrin T. Mish. For over 15 years, he's been helping taxpayers with IRS problems reclaim their lives and their financial stability. Now, here's your host of the IRS Solution Attorney Show, Darrin T. Mish.
Good morning, and welcome to the IRS problem. Actually, the IRS
Solution Attorney Show. I'll get it right for you this morning.
That's right. We don't focus on the negatives. We focus on the positives. It's the IRS Solution Attorney Show. I am the IRS Solution Attorney. I'm Darrin T. Mish.
And I'm your co-host,
by
Katrina Madewell.
Absolutely.
And we're live, just in case you couldn't catch that, because we definitely would have edited that out if we weren't.
I would say so. We'd probably cut that mumble mouth out.
If you have questions, you can call us, 888-404-1010. 888-404-1010. We will take them at various places throughout the show.
I have to say, I'm fired up to be here today.
Yay!
It's kind of a nice time of the year. You know, it's post craziness, post crazy filing deadline. The funny thing is, I think we're actually busier at the office now than we were before the 18th of April.
That's because it's past the 15th.
Yeah, it might be. People are, I don't know. It's still a great time of year. The weather's still really nice, and it's always fun to talk about IRS solutions.
That's what you do. That's your forte. Certainly not mine, but I'm always having fun on the show with you. But our topic for today's show is things you should know about filing late and paying penalties. That's pretty right on time.
Yeah, newsflash. If you didn't file an extension, and we're live today, it's April 28th.
Must be. We said it at the same time without looking.
I think it's the 28th.
Yep, it is.
And if you have not filed or filed an extension, then you have a significant, well, maybe not a significant problem, but you have a problem of sorts because you're going to pay some kind of penalty. And today we're going to talk about the different kinds of penalties and how to avoid them and, you know, what you should do if you find yourself in that situation.
Do they get a penalty even if there's a refund for not filing on time?
See, it's just not fair having a co-host who's co-hosted the show this long. You know the answer to that, don't you?
Yeah, but the person listening might not.
Okay, so you're right. There is, in fact, no penalty if you have a refund coming. There is kind of a penalty. And the
what? Well, I've never heard this spin on it.
There is kind of a penalty, and the sort of penalty is. So if you file, let's say you file a return that has a refund coming, you know you're going to get $1,000 back. You just kind of have that figured out. It's what happens every single year. This year's no different than any other year. If you file that return late without filing an extension, the IRS will not impose a penalty or interest upon you because penalties and interest are calculated based on amount of tax due, right? But the penalty is that there's only 3 years to file that refund return. If you actually file it more than 3 years late, then you do not get your refund. You do not get credit for the refund. You don't get an offset as to other money that you may owe. You just don't pass go, and you
but they don't actually ding you. I don't remember. What is the penalty like if you file late? Is it a dollar amount or a percentage of what you owe? It's a percentage, isn't it?
Let's talk about that now.
Let's do it.
The penalty for filing late, if you file more than 60 days after the due date or the extension due date, if you filed one on time, the minimum payment is $205. Or if you owe less than $205, it's 100% of the unpaid tax.
So I'm surprised they never, like, if you get a refund, they don't tack on that $205. Really surprised they haven't done that yet.
It's kind of surprising to me, too. You know, after doing this kind of work for almost 20 years, that's always kind of made me scratch my head. Because
so instead of getting a $1,000 refund, you get, like, $800.
Yeah.
Or $700.
I'm not really sure what I guess the rationale behind not putting a penalty there is probably there's a lot of people, they don't want to file those refund returns, right?
That makes sense.
Because if they didn't, you know, lots of people don't file refund returns. I know because I've talked to lots of them. I've talked to people who've been, you know, had a refund coming for 20 years, and they tell me I'm a non-filer. I say, why?
Yeah, I don't get that.
And they say something like, well, I don't want to be in the system, you know, in the system. And you're like, but
you're a W-2 employee. You're going to get money back.
You get a W-2. Let me explain. You're in the system. So I don't really get that. But
let me explain you. They already know who you are.
You have a number like everybody else. Speaking of numbers, you know, I have a couple kids, and I was in the delivery room when they were born, you know, years ago. And,
God, I hope so. Poor Heather, if you weren't.
Well, you know, in the generation before me, the guy just kind of sat out in the waiting room and like had cigars, like pink or blue cigars, right?
That's right.
But in my generation, we were expected to be in there, and it was a beautiful, lovely thing. But the oddest thing was, I mean, they won't let you out of the hospital without having a number assigned to your kid.
Yes.
It's bizarre. And I think that's only been in about maybe the past 15 years or so.
It's kind of good, though, when you think about the baby switching thing.
Okay. We're not to the point where they like chip you or tattoo that number on you,
but
right?
they do check you, like every single time they come in the room.
Yeah, that's true. So, but I met a couple one time. It's been a long time. It's been about 10 years ago that now. But they had a religious objection to Social Security numbers. And so consequently, and they had a number of kids. They were one of these religious sects that has lots of kids, and almost like an Amish or Mennonite kind of
no
situation.
Social Security numbers for any
and
of
they
them?
had no Social Security numbers for any of the kids. And I could not actually, this was back, when I wasn't quite as experienced as I am now, I actually couldn't figure out how to solve the problem.
That's hard.
We had this religious objection, and it just didn't fit in like the box of how to solve a case.
To be honest with you, hopefully, if there's somebody out there that can solve that problem, please call us, 888-404-1010, because someone that we know, we think he was like stolen from a hospital, and he's never had a Social Security number.
Really?
Always worked under
like
the table.
Like we mutually know, or you
No,
know?
It's somebody my husband knows.
Okay. That's interesting. Yeah, and I've also had another gentleman who had a Social Security number. He was a little bit older than I am, so he was a Vietnam vet. And when he was drafted, I think it was the Navy actually assigned him an incorrect Social Security number. Like they said, no, that's your number, and he's like, well, but that's not my Social Security number, and they just kind of dictated, well, you're drafted, that's your number.
There should be like an attorney like you that specializes in helping IRS issues. There shouldn't be an attorney that does nothing but help fix Social Security issues.
I actually solved his problem, and I can't remember how, but we did get it worked out. I think it did default to the non-DOD Social Security number.
Was this pre or after 9/11?
Oh, it was pre 9/11.
Because see, that's changed a lot.
Yeah, the whole security apparatus of the United States, the Patriot Act, and all that has really changed.
Because it's not like you can just, I never got one, let's file. It's not that easy.
Yeah. It's funny, I was of the generation where I went down to the Social Security office probably on my bicycle and applied for a card when I was about 14 years old. And I got the number, and I for years and years and years, I carried the little card around in my wallet, which is really bad practice. Don't do that, people.
Yeah, don't do that.
Because... but back then that was pre-identity theft.
For
and
your
all that.
kids, didn't you get them like right away?
In the hospital. Yeah. And the funny thing is that you need those for the tax returns and whatnot, but their cards are actually in a safe because I can't remember what their numbers are, and I kind of don't want to think of them as a number, So,
I never thought about it like that, but it makes sense to me.
Back then, you only had to remember like 5 numbers for your card, wasn't it?
Oh.
No, Pat, that was your generation. You're mixing it up.
No, Pat's of the 2-digit generation.
No, mine's A or B. AB1, AB3.
They ran out of numbers.
So, let's get back to the penalty thing. As fascinating as my stories are, there's if you didn't file a return, on the 18th this year, then 2 penalties actually could apply. And one is for filing late, and the other one could be potentially for paying late. And that's one of the reasons we were talking about the refund here.
Right.
If you have a refund, then you're not going to have a late payment penalty, and you're actually not going to have a late filing penalty either. But
they wouldn't want to pay a percentage on money they owe you because then they would actually owe you a little bit more.
Yeah, I think the longer we talk about this and why there's not a penalty for late filing of a refund return, it's got to be that they don't want to incentivize those millions of people who don't file their refund returns and therefore never get their refunds because our government's essentially broke, and they probably need those. That's probably hundreds of millions of dollars at a bare minimum.
It's probably one of those things that slide under the radar, and nobody talks about it except for us.
Yeah.
So
tax geeks.
Well, that's not me. I talk about it with you. You're the tax geek, but but you're good at it. You're good at the attorney IRS stuff.
So
penalty. So the penalty for late filing.
The penalty for late filing, I said, was $205, or if it's less than $205 at a minimum, then it's 100% of the unpaid tax. So if you filed a return and you owed $117 hypothetically, then your penalty is not $205, it's $117, which is kind of steep if you look at it in that perspective. But if you only owe $117 on a tax return, you should probably be doing a happy dance because that's not really all that bad in the overall scheme of what I see every day anyway.
So I'm looking at our outline that says that if you owe less than $205, it's 100% of the unpaid tax. I think you should elaborate on that.
That's what I just said. So if you filed a tax return and you owed $117 of tax, then your penalty would be $117.
No. But if it's over $205, let's say you owe $1,000.
Yeah, if you owe over $205, So if you owe 1,000, the penalty can be as much as 5% of the unpaid taxes each month, up to a maximum of 25%. So that's really steep.
And is there a grace period or anything for that, like a 60-day rule or anything extra we should throw in that after the break, maybe?
No, any portion of any month counts as another month.
Gotcha. Well, you're listening to the IRS Solution Attorney Show. If you have not filed those tax returns and you're late and you have a question, you can call us. 888-404-1010. You should already have that saved in your phone, but it's 888-404-1010. We'll be back in a minute. Thanks, Pat George, for keeping the music real and right on time for the topic of the show.
I just about let loose.
Started singing?
Yeah, absolutely. I forgot I wasn't in the shower.
Oh, no, I don't know if that would be pretty.
No,
but you're listening,
it would be very bad, actually.
You're listening to the IRS Solution Attorney Show with Mr. Darrin T. Mish. That's him, obviously. And
That's me.
I'm your co-host, Katrina Madewell. And today's topic is things you should know if you filed late or you have to pay penalties.
On your tax returns. So let's recap real quick what we talked about. If you actually file late or you don't do an extension, and so therefore you don't have any more time, then there's two penalties that can apply. One is for filing late and one is for paying late. Common misperception is that if you get an extension until October 15th, that you have until October 15th to pay your taxes. And negative, that's not correct. You're actually supposed to calculate and pay your taxes by the deadline, which is usually April 15th, but this year was April 18th. And it's always been kind of counterintuitive to me, right? So
I don't think people realize there's two penalties. That's the thing. You get one penalty for not filing on time, and you get another one if you owe money.
And we kind of glossed over this because we ran out of time in the last segment, and that is that the payment for the late filing is, it can be as much as 5% of your unpaid taxes each month, up to a maximum of 25%. And a month is a fraction of a month. So if it's 32 days, that's not 1 month, that's 2 months.
What?
Yeah, that's 2 months. So any fraction of a month counts as another month.
Are you serious?
Yeah. So what we see typically when we have, non-filers, my bread and butter, people who just don't file tax returns for 6, 7, 10, 20, 50 years in some cases, and we get their last 6 years of tax returns prepared and filed, what we typically see is that the tax balances with penalties and interest accruing actually double every 6.5 or 7 years. It depends on the interest rates at the time and the economy and things like that. But pretty much that's the general rule.
$1,000 after 6 years is $2,000.
Yeah, well, and that's not all that scary. But when you owe $100,000,
right,
and now it's $200,000. Now we're talking, right? I mean, this is a lot different situation.
It's normally who your client is.
Yeah, my client is not typically the person that owes $1,000.
I was easing into it, because we were talking about refunds and then the $1,000 penalty. I didn't want to go right into $100,000.
Yeah, well, I mean, my perspective is a little bit warped, right? So when someone comes in and says, I owe a lot of money, the first question I have to say is, well, can you define a lot?
What's a lot of money to you?
Because it's all perspective, A lot is my client who owed $23 million. That's a lot of money. I think anybody could say that. Even Donald Trump would probably say that's a lot of money. But, a lot of money is more money than you want to pay, right?
Yeah, which is probably why they haven't filed, but,
So let's talk about the penalty for late payment. That penalty is generally 0.5% of your unpaid taxes per month, and it can build up to as much as 25% as well. So what's 25 plus 25? That's 50%. So at a certain point in time, it's relatively quick. The penalty can actually be 50% of the unpaid tax. And so
keeping our simple math at $1,000 due.
Yeah. Within several months, it'll be $1,500, and then there'll be interest accruing on the tax. On
top of that
and the penalties, and the interest is compounded daily.
Okay, so that's compounded based on the balance they have at that time, right?
Exactly.
You're not talking about the initial tax of $1,000.
So people always want to know, well, what's the interest rate right now? Well, it's not really that relevant of a question, but right now I do believe it's 3%, which sounds like very reasonable and fair, right? Except for it's compounded daily on penalties of up to 50%.
Like even your mortgages are not calculated in compound interest anymore. They're calculated in simple interest, which is totally different.
Right. So these things get out of hand really, really fast. So, the best advice is if you can't file on time, pay as much as you can of the taxes that you think you may owe and file an extension. And if you file an extension, make sure that you can prove that the extension was sent on before the deadline. Right. Otherwise, you're going to have penalties because they're going to say, well, we didn't get it on time and that kind of thing.
I'm just waiting for you to tell the war story about someone that has this and they filed it and they took like a selfie and posted it on Instagram with a date, in their letter.
I don't think the IRS is technologically, hip enough to
I know, but I'm
accept
just
the
curious.
selfie.
Like, I could see you using that as a defense.
Wouldn't
That's
that be
why
cool? You could take like a selfie with a newspaper from that day.
Yes.
Or something like that. But my story is personal experience. One year I sent in an extension right on the deadline due date, but I sent it in certified mail, and I got a letter about a month later saying that you have a late filing penalty because you didn't file an extension, and I made the mistake. It's kind of a rookie bonehead mistake. I don't know why I did this, but I called them, and on the phone the lady was saying, well, we're right, you're wrong, tough luck, and my penalty was $500. And there's a classic definition, right? $500 was a lot of money to me because it was more than I wanted to pay.
Because you filed on time.
If I had filed the extension on time. So she says, toward the end of the conversation, she's being really rude and kind of nasty and curt. And I said, or she says, unless you have that green slip showing that for the certified mail showing that you sent it in, on or before the due date, then you're going to owe us the penalty. And I said, well, as a matter of fact, I do have a copy of that green slip.
Do you want to eat some crow now or later? I'm just asking.
Exactly. So I think that cost me $5 or $6 to send that in that particular year. And it's about the same now. And that saved me roughly 100 years worth of late filing penalty. So I thought that was definitely worth it.
And I guess the bigger issue is like you said, file on time if you can within the first or second extension, and then pay whatever you can, even if it's not all of it.
Yeah, back to that whole idea of you're supposed to pay your tax, by the deadline, whether or not your return is due or not. Well, I can tell you with firsthand experience that self-employed people don't know what they are going to owe. And
so what happens if they're like, all right, I'm just going to take a stab at it and send a random check for whatever they have in mind? Let's say they think it's $1,000, right? It's the magic number of the day. They think it's $1,000. They send the check. And let's say they don't quite owe that much. Maybe they only owe $500. Are they going to get that money back from the IRS?
I'm going to change your example because I don't like it. $1,000 is there's no
all right,
skin in the game.
Fine.
It's $10,000. Let's say I think I'm going to owe $10,000. So they send in certified funds for $10,000, but their return says they only owed $7,000. Okay, $5,000, whatever. Yeah, they get the $5,000 back, or there's also...
Yeah, but how much do they have to hunt the IRS down and chase them to get it?
They won't.
They don't?
They don't, because that's just a refund, just exactly like if on your W-2 you had overpayments on your W-2.
It's a very valid question, though.
Yes, it is. And there's also another option where you can just elect to have that money pushed forward into the next tax year.
What? I've never heard that one before.
Yeah, you can go ahead and have that, that refund applied to the next year. And if you're a self-employed
the refund, not the tax.
Not the tax. The refund. So if you're a self-employed kind of person that's going to always owe, or you feel like you're always going to owe and you're always going to have to pay estimated tax payments, then it's actually kind of a liberating feeling to just push that refund into the next year. Now, does it make a lot of sense mathematically? No, not really.
Put the money somewhere else.
Because they've already, they've had that money for the year. But if your first quarter estimated tax payment is going to be roughly equal to your refund, then it kind of does make sense, right?
Yeah, if you're using it right away and not paying it, sure.
Exactly. If it's more than you're going to owe for the following year, then by all means, go ahead and get the money back.
So in that scenario where maybe they do or they don't know how much they owe, but they know they owe some money, they should, what kind of payment options are there if they know they don't have all of the money to pay, whatever it is?
Well, the first thing is, and this is actually pretty neat. It's kind of a secret thing. You can call the IRS. You have to call before the CP 504 letter comes.
Okay, what? That's nerd talk. What is that?
The CP 504 is a letter that comes certified mail, and it says notice of intent to levy. Now, conspicuously absent is the word final. Okay. So it says notice of intent to levy, and it's a pretty scary letter, but when you read it, it just talks about the IRS could levy, which means seize, your state tax refunds. So to people in Florida, where we are right now, big deal. We don't have state tax refunds. Who cares? But the CP 504 accelerates those penalties, number one.
Which means?
So it makes those penalties go out to the max to where they can eventually be 50% of the tax. So you want to call the IRS before you get that CP 504 letter, which is usually not going to come any faster than about 75 to 90 days. Okay, so if you call within the first 75 to 90 days after you file a return, and you can ask them for this. This is pretty cool stuff. You ask them for a 4-month extension to investigate the possibility of you being able to full pay the tax liability.
Okay, well, say that again and then explain it.
So you call the IRS and you ask them for a 4-month extension, and you say, I'm trying to full pay this, and so I need 4 months to see if I can get that all together. Now, if you owe $1,000, I mean, this is eminently
use your
reasonable.
10 grand, 10,000.
Even 10,000, that's eminently reasonable. You know, like 4 months just to kind of see if you can get it done. I've done this on $100,000 cases, $200,000 cases, and it's not always, fiction. Sometimes that is the solution. Like somebody's going to sell a house, there's no lien yet, and they're going to sell the house and they're going to full pay this big liability. But the neat thing about this 120-day extension is, on day 119 or day 120, you can call and just work out some other thing, some other solution to the problem, and that can usually work out too. But this is going to get you 4 months with minimal penalties and more time to figure out what it is you need to do.
Makes sense to me. You are listening to the IRS Solution Attorney Show. Just in case you didn't already know that, we're happy to have you with us. If you have a question related to today's show, please call us, 888-404-1010. We're happy to answer them. Even if you want to just call and say hello in your commute, we're happy to talk to you. 888-404-1010. We'll be back with some other great tips and also some relevant stories. We'll be back in a minute.
Are you suffering from IRS problems? Do you owe back taxes you can't pay? Is your paycheck or bank account being levied? Or maybe you haven't filed tax returns in years and simply don't know what to do. This is Darrin T. Mish to tell you that if you're tired of IRS problems hanging over your head and are ready for a fresh start, we may be able to help. Call the law offices of Darrin T. Mish at 888-GET-MISH, 888-GET-MISH. I can help you file old tax returns, work to release tax liens or stop wage levies, even negotiate deals to pay off back taxes at a discount, sometimes for pennies on the dollar. Hey, let's face it, these days it's not hard to get into tax trouble. A divorce, failed business, health problems, you name it. The point is, IRS problems may be solved if you're willing to take the first step. Call for a free consultation at 888-GET-MISH. That's 888-438-6474. Or go to the web at getirshelp.com, because the one sure thing is, IRS problems don't solve themselves. So get Mish. 888-438-6474. Principal Office, Tampa.
Sorry, I ain't got no money. I'm not trying to be funny, but I left it all at home today. You can call me what you wanna. I ain't giving you $1 this time. I ain't gonna run away. You might knock me down. You might knock me down.
That's Pat George digging deep for the bumper music. I'm liking it. It's a lot different than money.
Great.
That was
Who is that anyway? Do you know? He's thinking about it. Digging it out of the DJ archives. See, I put him on the gun and he's like, oh, snap.
I think it's Galantis.
He wasn't expecting that.
Galantis, yeah.
Okay, so moving right along, since I have
I want to
nothing
make sure
say
you're
about
paying attention to
Galantis.
the show, Pat.
So the topic of the show is things you should know about filing late and paying penalties for doing such. And we talked about the different kinds of penalties for, filing a tax return late without an extension and paying your taxes late without an extension. It doesn't matter. And so let's talk about how do you actually, before the break, we were talking about you can get a 120-day extension, right? So you can investigate, the possibility of full payment of the tax. If that doesn't work, then you can, if you owe under $50,000, it's relatively simple to get into a payment plan, which they call an installment agreement, to pay off your taxes over time. So basically, if you owe $50,000 and it can full pay within 72 months, they're probably going to give you that payment. You got to bump it up for interest and penalties, and that kind of thing. But there is one thing that I wanted to bring up, and that's called IRS Direct Pay. It's actually a portion of their website, which is at irs.gov/payments. Now, I'm not usually a big fan of the government because I think they screw pretty much everything up. The bureaucracy is just a mess. But that website, that web address actually makes sense, right? It's IRS Gov website and then /payments. I would probably change it to pay us or pay your bill, but
Pay Uncle Sam now.
Uncle wants your money, something like that. But I've actually used this, and it's really pretty simple. You just they used to have a situation where you had to pay a fee, like an extra fee of $4 or $5 to pay the IRS, but now they have finally figured out that the rest of business and commerce, you can make electronic payments that aren't that don't cost money.
Right.
And you can actually use credit cards if you need to. And on those, there's a number of providers, and you do have to pay a percentage and the fee and all that kind of stuff.
Is there ever a time that the late payment penalty does not apply?
Yeah, if you requested an extension of time to file your taxes.
So like right now, someone filed an extension.
Yeah, and you had already paid in at least 90% of what you ultimately owe, then you're not going to have.
We could use our same example. So 10 grand.
So if you
paid in 5, or maybe more than 5, it'd be 75.
They paid in. Let's say the ultimate tax bill is 10 grand, and they paid in $9,100. Then there's not going to be any late payment penalty because 90% is considered close enough. It's like horseshoes and hand grenades. It's 90% is close enough in IRS land. So if you had that situation, then you would not have a late payment penalty, which would be a good thing. And I think that's their basic recognition that people, need to get close enough, and they might not know exactly. But if you're going to owe $100,000 on your tax bill, then you probably ought to pay in more than $1,000 because you kind of know it's coming,
right?
And
so, last week we had some folks listening, and we have to recognize that a lot of times people, they don't want to call the studio number, the 888-404-1010. So you can reach Darrin directly at his office.
At 888-GET-MISH. That's 888-GET-MISH, 888-438-6474. That's our office phone number, and you can, that works toll free. Even in Puerto Rico, when I was in Puerto Rico, I tried it, and it does, in fact, work down there.
And he's also across the web on Facebook, on Twitter, on all your social feeds. You can get him on Twitter at Darrin_Mish.
Yeah, and our website address is getirshelp.com. So it's getirshelp.com. And so you can actually find access to lots of videos, lots of podcast episodes. All of the radio show episodes are on there, as well as just tons and tons and tons of content. It's been a project we've been working on for over 15 years. And so it's one of the biggest sites in the tax problem.
You've got a lot of things, including a book, which are like secret tips, or what's the name of your book, Darrin? Secret tips the IRS doesn't want you to know?
Yeah, the seven secrets that the IRS doesn't want you to know. That book is available on the website. It's also available on Amazon and Kindle and all those kind of places. That book is more about just things, it's really, I didn't write that book to make money. I wrote that book so that people would know what these secrets are that the IRS doesn't want them to know. And we really should do a whole show on that sometime.
Yeah, I think we will do that. Maybe in a couple of weeks we'll plan it out and do that.
So
the reason why I mentioned your office line is because we actually got a message from Pat that someone tried to call in last week and they couldn't get through. And so they wanted to ask their question on Twitter. And so he wants to know, his father informed him that he hasn't filed his tax returns in 12 years. What's the procedure for filing missing tax returns? That's from Joan. Thank you for listening, Joan.
The first thing I'd say is don't freak out, okay? Because despite the fact that probably later in the show we're going to talk about some people who were criminally prosecuted and did go to prison for similar behavior, the IRS, it is rare, and the IRS does not have the capability, the capacity to prosecute everyone who is a non-filer. So,
nor do the prison systems, for that matter.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to. I actually spoke to.
What are you in for, murder? What are you in for? Not filing my taxes?
Well, the irony of that comment is I was talking to a guy who was a local politician here who ultimately was prosecuted for tax fraud, and the amount of fraud was very it was under six figures. And he told me the story about going to prison. I said, well, how was it? And he says, well, prison's not good. I was in a camp. He says, so it wasn't that bad. But he said, I'd be talking to the other guys, and they'd say, what are you in for? He'd say, tax fraud. And then they find out the amount. And he said it basically, he was the butt of all jokes in the prison because what he did was so minor as compared to the other guys that were in there. So back to Joan's question. Dad hasn't filed tax returns for 12 years. Well, number one question is going to be, was he a wage earner or self-employed, right? So if he was a wage earner and had appropriate taxes withheld from his paycheck, then it's really not a big deal. You're going to file the last 6 years worth of returns just so you can avoid the criminal statute of limitations for prosecution of the crime of failing to file a tax return. So you're going to just file the past 6 years. He's probably going to have refunds coming. He's only going to get the refunds for ding, 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 3 years. He's not going to get any credit or anything offset or anything for the 3 years before that. Although
but he's in compliance.
Although I have seen refunds from 5 years back. And
Really?
It just happens sometimes. It's kind of bizarre.
Sweet.
Yeah, so if that happens, that's just kind of like a windfall. But if he was self-employed, this can probably be more complicated. Now, if he was self-employed, 1099 kind of person, had one basic, employer, let's just call him that. It's not the right word, but let's say he was a painting contractor, but he always went out and painted for the same guy, and he got one 1099. Well, that's not such a hard thing to figure out, what the income was and the expenses. Now, if he was a painting contractor and he just dealt with the general public and he has no records, this is significantly more complicated, right? Because I'm actually dealing with somebody right now who is a contractor, has a contracting type of business, peripherally related to construction, and doesn't necessarily keep any records.
Did they get 1099s? Did they?
Some, but the 1099s might only cover,
percentage of what they got.
5% of the total gross revenue. So what we would do in Joan's father's case is we would get a power of attorney, which allows us to communicate with the IRS, and we would get the transcripts from the IRS that showed us what 1099s were filed, or W-2s in this case.
Against their social?
Or, against their social, and their 1098s, which is like mortgage interest and that kind of thing, and help us to basically see what the IRS has with regard to that taxpayer, and then try to
Then you
prepare
pick
a
up your
tax return
plan
from
and
there.
figure out where to start.
So what we do, which is a little bit different than most guys in my business, is we try not to file the returns until, like in a situation like this, where they're not bugging him, he just hasn't filed. We try to get all the returns prepared and devise a plan before we file return number one.
Makes sense.
Because when you file return number one, I just told you, like within 75 to 90 days, you're going to start getting relatively scary letters, and the penalties are going to accumulate.
You're going to say,
and stuff like that.
you want to play ball? We're here.
Right, exactly. So that the filing of that first return after you've been missing for a while is a catalyst to getting the ball rolling. The IRS kind of knows you're back on the radar, and then they're going to start the collection machine, which is largely automated. So that's another reason why oftentimes we won't just start representation with a phone call to the IRS. So in Joan's father's case, let's say, a lot of reps who were inexperienced or don't really know why you wouldn't do this, a lot of those guys would just literally, with him in the office, pick up the phone and call the IRS. This is like malpractice, in my opinion, because the IRS is going to go, well, Joan's father, you've been missing for a while, and then they're going to give you a deadline, typically of 30 to 60 days, and then it's on. After that, day 61, if you're not complying.
You've raised your hands, and now the attention is on you.
Yeah, you put a big neon sign target on your back, like, hey, I'm here and I've been a bad boy. So
have a plan.
Yeah, try to have a plan.
So one of our listeners, Jim, he has a question. He says, what are your thoughts on the Panama Papers? Is it more smoke than fire?
So let's talk about what the Panama Papers are.
Yeah, because I don't know what it is.
I haven't been following it really closely, but my understanding is there was a massive data breach of attorney-client privilege information that came out of Panama. And Panama is it's been for years, decades, it's been a haven for offshore banking. What does offshore banking mean? Well, it means that there are certain countries. Yeah, there are certain countries where their laws are conducive to putting large amounts of money in those, in those jurisdictions, so they're not overly taxed in their secrecy and privacy and whatnot. All of the privacy for U.S. citizens all around the world is pretty much gone. So when I saw the data breach on the Panama Papers, I thought to myself, well, if there are Americans that are involved in that didn't report those foreign bank accounts, so that they're in big trouble. But there is nothing in and of itself illegal or unethical about being wealthy in constructing your affairs such that you pay less tax. There's nothing illegal about that, right? Apple actually has a huge presence in Ireland, and one of the reasons is because the Irish banking laws are really, advantageous. Bermuda is another one of these countries where a lot of U.S. companies, are so-called headquartered in Bermuda. I've been to Bermuda. There's no manufacturing that I ever saw in Bermuda, but it's because of their banking laws and whatnot. So I think the Panama Papers for Americans is largely, it's more smoke than fire. I don't think it's really that big a deal. I have seen some rumors that, some high-level politicians that are running for office now might be peripherally related or involved. I don't know. I haven't seen anything that I thought was all that interesting. And again, just setting up your financial affairs so that you pay less tax is perfectly legal. In fact, there's been court case after court case that says that's not just legal. It's, it's preferred in many cases.
Taxpayer rates, I would think.
Yeah. So taking advantage of the tax law is not really a problem. Not filing or committing fraud, those are problems.
So we do have a couple stories. We can at least start it and then probably finish it after the break. But there's one story in the headline news that prominent Rapid City businessman gets years in prison on tax evasion.
Yeah, this is a guy in South Dakota, in Rapid City, South Dakota, which is a really cool place. It's close to Mount Rushmore in the Black Hills. And he was running a business, and it was related to construction. It started going downhill, and instead of laying off employees, he didn't pay his taxes, and now he's in big trouble.
Ouch. We'll talk about his whopping penalty or the amount owed and stuff when we get back in a minute. You're listening to the IRS Solution Attorney Show with Mr. Darrin T. Mish, and I'm your co-host, Katrina Madewell. If you have one of these questions that are right on time, you can call us at 888-404-1010, 888-404-1010, or if you want to call Darrin's office directly, you can at 888-GET-MISH.
888-438-6474.
We'll be back in a minute. Keeping it right on time and right with your lifestyle, right? The way you like it?
Yeah, a little tribute to Panama there in the Panama Papers.
So you're listening to the IRS Solution Attorney Show. We were talking about, real quick before the break, a prominent Rapid City businessman. He went to prison for tax evasion.
So the story, as I understand it, was he was a contractor. He had a construction company. And when the economic downturn occurred in 2008,
He didn't want to let anybody off.
He started having trouble. You know, obviously a lot of people did. In fact, most people probably did if they were self-employed, because it was just a shock to the economy. And he needed to make some tough decisions in business. And I see this a lot in payroll tax problems, and that is that...
And that's the worst tax you can know, right?
Yeah, payroll taxes are the most serious, and the government takes them the most seriously. And the reason is that you're withholding taxes for the benefit of the employee and the government. It's actually, that part is called the trust fund portion. It's called trust fund for a reason. You're supposed to be holding it in trust for the government and the employee. And so when you don't do that as the employer, then there's serious ramifications. Now, not every...
Now, do those ever get any lower? Or are they always like, bam, you owe $270, that's what it is?
Well, the irony is, you know, a lot of people can do offers and compromises on that kind of tax. I've done it. And you can do an installment agreement. There's lots of things that you can do. And I found this particular story interesting because I have cases in my inventory right now where they owe more than $270,000. I think that the real gist of this situation is that this gentleman was a well-known figure in Rapid City, South Dakota. Rapid City's not a real big place. I would say it's probably the equivalent size of, Bradenton or something, maybe even Brandon. It's just not that big of a place. And so he was a big name in that city. And when it became known, when the IRS, became aware that he was behind on his taxes, they decided to, refer him for prosecution and make an example of him. Now, there were some aggravating factors too, in that it wasn't just that he was this soft-hearted, kind-hearted guy who didn't want to lay off employees. I mean, he had vacation homes and boats and motorcycles and those kinds of things.
Which they love that kind of stuff, don't they?
Yeah, he had a healthy lifestyle, and he didn't make the hard choices at the beginning when the business was beginning to suffer. And that's what I see quite a bit. And I've learned for my own business that when things start to look like they're going downhill, you have to make
changes.
You have to make changes. You have to make cuts. You might cut your own salary. You might cut unnecessary employees or other expenses, but you have to make those changes because, hope is not a strategy.
No, it's not a business plan either.
And wishing that it will go away doesn't typically work. I'm sure it has at some point.
So do you think he'll actually do a whole year in federal prison?
The guy that I spoke with this week that he was sentenced to a year did about 5 months in a camp kind of a place,
okay.
A minimum security kind of place, because it's generally considered to be white collar crime. And so you're not going to be in Fort Leavenworth or that kind of thing. But it's not a fun time, and I'm sure he didn't enjoy it.
So we have one more story real quick. There's another guy in Branson. He pled guilty to tax evasion.
This story I found was really interesting. It was a member of a Branson performance group called Six. And he actually pled guilty to not filing or paying federal and state income taxes for over $1 million of income over a 6-year period. And what I found to be interesting was it's $1 million of income, which sounds like a lot, right?
Yeah.
Over a 6-year period? It's really not that much money. But again, I think this is a situation where he was a part of this, this well-known Branson Performance Group, right? He didn't pay his taxes on about $250,000 of income. And I'm sure there's people listening right now saying, well, that's a rich guy and he's not paying his fair share. Right. And I'm not going to say I disagree with that. I'm just saying that in my experience, this is not a real large case either. I have cases in my inventory right now that, exceed that. So it's interesting because it's one of these situations where if you're a prominent person, if you're a person that's in the spotlight, if you're a doctor or a lawyer or a judge or a politician, or have a business that's, well known in the area, and you're, a non-filer, non-payer, tax fraud, tax evasion kind of thing, then there is a better chance than average that you're going to be prosecuted for those types of offenses.
So what do you think the dealio is with him waiving his right to a grand jury? You think that was a good idea and just pleading guilty?
I think it was a deal.
Yeah.
I think that he decided that he was going to go ahead and just cooperate in full from the beginning. He probably got some advice from, probably a pretty good lawyer that go ahead and cooperate because cooperation is a mitigating factor. And he'll probably do like a year as well.
Right on time.
Every time that comes on, it scares me to death. It's time for the IRS train wreck of the week. This is the segment of the show where I get to talk about someone who came into the office.
And they were a hot mess.
They were a train wreck. And, here's the punchline. They always leave. It's always a happy ending. So in this particular case, it was also a contractor. It seems like that's the theme for today.
That's the theme of the week.
And he, over a period of years, ended up owing the IRS $207,000, about 207, 208. That was the number. And we filed an offer in compromise. An offer in compromise is where you make a deal to settle for less. And it's
every time you say that, I'm like, deal with the devil. Yep.
It's a deal to settle for less. And basically, it's a math equation. And I won't bore you with the details of that math equation. And there's actually two types of offers that we're going to talk about. One is a cash offer, which means the IRS wants their cash, whatever you offered them. They want that within 5 months of acceptance of the offer.
Oh, really? Cash is 5 months?
They have 5 months.
Wow.
From
I was
acceptance.
thinking like 3 days or 30 days or something like that.
Yeah. So only in government land is cash, 5 months later. And the offer takes about a year and a half to process. But in this particular case, there's another kind of offer as well that we don't talk about that much. And it's called a short-term deferred payment option. And what that means is they have 24 months to make the payments on their offer amount. And the multipliers are different. So usually the 24-month option is double the money, but you get to pay it off over 2 years. In this case,
and I think you glazed over that, but didn't you say it takes a year or so to file the paperwork and then your 5-month clock starts ticking?
Exactly. Now, in most short-term deferred offers, the IRS wants you to start making your monthly payments on month 1, when you file the offer, and they want you to make those payments while the offer is pending. I can confidently say I have never done that because I don't agree with it. I don't like it. But in some cases, and I can't go into too much detail, but where the assets constitute the amount of the offer, it makes sense to go ahead and spread it out over a 24-month payoff. So in this particular case, they owed $207,000. We got it settled for $13,640, so $13,640. And because of some money they had already paid down, that works out to $547.17 a month for 2 years. And he was
done after 2 years.
Yeah, he'll be done after 2 years. And actually, in his particular case, he couldn't raise $13,000 all at once, but he thinks he can do it relatively quickly, and so he'll probably full pay and be off of that kind of probation kind of status really pretty soon. So that was a really happy ending. That offer had lots of twists and turns, and we thought it wasn't going to work, but it ultimately worked out great.
Well, you are listening to Mr. Darrin T. Mish, and this is the IRS Solution Attorney Show. I'm your co-host, Katrina Madewell. Pat George back there on the board doing a great job. Thank you.
Thank you. Because of this show, I'm going to open my own accounting office as much as I learn every week.
We appreciate you listening. Thank you so much for calling. If you are listening, if you want to call Darrin directly, 888-GET-MISH. We'll be back next week. Same time, same place. For this week,
we're out.